Today we're going to look at commas, tricky pieces of punctuation that trip up English learners and native speakers alike. Hi, I'm Sharon. Thank you for joining me today. In this video, we're going to look at punctuation for your OET letter, specifically how to use commas. This is one of the most common difficulties people have when writing in English, and even native speakers struggle with this one. It's true that there are some complicated rules about commas, but the basics of comma use are really not that difficult. So let's take a look at how you can use commas to do well in your OET writing subtest. When we're done, we'll have a little quiz so you can check and see how well you've understood. Here are some common ways to use a comma: complex sentences, compound sentences, introductory phrases, transitional phrases, and lists of ideas or items. You might be wondering what the difference is between a complex sentence and a compound sentence. They're both made of two clauses or phrases that are joined with a comma. A complex sentence contains one independent clause and one dependent clause. A compound sentence contains two independent clauses. Remember that an independent clause contains a verb just like a sentence, and it could stand on its own as a sentence by itself. Let's look at complex sentences first. The comma rule for these will change according to which clause comes first, the independent clause or the dependent clause. If the independent clause comes first, we don't need a comma. If the dependent clause comes first, use a comma to separate the two clauses. Here are some examples. Treatment will begin after a full diagnosis is made. The independent clause is treatment will begin, which is a complete sentence by itself with a subject, treatment, and a verb, will begin. The dependent clause is after a full diagnosis is made. You might think this is another independent clause because of the verb is made, but because we also have the word after, it doesn't contain enough information to be a sentence by itself, so it's a dependent clause. And since the independent clause comes first, treatment will begin after a full diagnosis is made, no comma is necessary. When you read it out loud, you'll notice that you don't need to pause as you read. That's a good indication that you don't need to add a comma when you write. Now let's put the dependent clause first. After a full diagnosis is made, treatment will begin. In this sentence, the dependent clause needs to be set apart with a comma. When you read it out loud, you'll see that you need to pause between the clauses. That's a good indication that when you write this sentence, you'll need to use a comma. Here's another example. The patient's symptoms were aggravated due to noncompliance with medication. The independent clause is the patient's symptoms were aggravated. The dependent clause is due to noncompliance with medication. Here, because the independent clause comes first, we don't need to use a comma. The patient's symptoms were aggravated due to noncompliance with medication. However, when we put the dependent clause first, we need the comma to separate them. Due to noncompliance with medication, the patient's symptoms were aggravated. Let's look at one more example. Do not hesitate to contact me if you require further information. The independent clause is do not hesitate to contact me. This is an imperative sentence, so it has an understood you as the subject. The verb is do not hesitate. You do not hesitate to contact me. It's a complete sentence by itself. If you need further information is the dependent clause. There's a complete sentence there, you need further information, but because of the if, it's turned into a dependent clause, a phrase that needs more information to make sense. And again, if we put the dependent clause first, we'll need to separate them with a comma. If you require further information, do not hesitate to contact me. So to sum up, Complex sentences are joined with a comma when the dependent clause comes first. Now let's look at compound sentences. Remember that compound sentences are made up of two or more independent clauses, and an independent clause is basically a complete sentence with a subject and a verb. These two independent clauses need to be joined with a comma and a conjunction. Here's a sample sentence. We do not have the patient's records because the procedure was performed at a different facility. There are two complete sentences here. We do not have the patient's records. The procedure was performed at a different facility. The word because is a conjunction that joins the two sentences. You might be thinking, how is this different from the other sentences that were joined with after, due to, and if? Well, that's a really good question. The key is that the word because is a conjunction, a word whose job it is to join two things. Remember, a compound sentence is joined with a comma and a conjunction. When we looked at the complex sentences, our dependent clauses started with the words after, due to, and if. But these words are not conjunctions, and when they were used, they turned their phrases into dependent clauses. You can also switch the order of the independent clauses, but they should still be joined with a comma and a conjunction. The procedure was performed at a different facility, so we don't have the patient's records. In this sentence, the conjunction is so. Now you might be wondering if you can just write two sentences instead of worrying about clauses and commas. The simple answer is yes, you certainly could. However, in this case, the sentences are both describing one topic, so it's logical to combine them into one sentence. For OET writing especially, you want to keep your writing organized and smooth. Using compound sentences is one way to do this. And if you use a compound sentence, you can demonstrate your clear knowledge of English to the assessor. Look at these two sentences. Mrs. Trafford was sent to the specialist. The cause of her headaches was unknown. Both of these complete sentences make total sense by themselves. However, they depend on each other. Why was Mrs. Trafford sent to the specialist? How did she determine the cause of her headaches? Read individually, they sound rather choppy and disconnected. Combining these sentences will help keep your writing smooth and easy to understand. Let's take a look. Mrs. Trafford was sent to the specialist because the cause of her headaches was unknown. Even though we actually gained a word, the conjunction because, can you see how changing these two sentences into one compound sentence helps keep your letter organized and makes your writing smoother and easier to understand? Here's another example. Mr. Johnson neglected to make a follow-up appointment. His headaches returned in September. You can see that these sentences are related to each other by cause and effect. Let's combine them so it sounds smoother. Mr. Johnson neglected to make a follow-up appointment, so his headaches returned in September. Two complete sentences joined by a comma and a conjunction. We can reverse the sentences as well. Mr. Johnson's headaches returned in September because he neglected to make a follow-up appointment. Make sure that the conjunction you use is appropriate for the meaning of the sentence. Sometimes, when the independent clauses are very short, the comma can be omitted, but you should still use the conjunction. Here's an example. He exercises regularly, but he overeats on the weekend. She followed your advice and she had a good result. And just a little extra note, since these sentences are very short, you can also delete the subject in the second independent clause because it's understood from the first clause. He exercises regularly but overeats on the weekend. She followed your advice and had a good result. And these are the basics of complex and compound sentences. And this should be really all you need to remember for your OET test. But there is another way to join two independent clauses, and I'll briefly mention it here. Look at this sentence. We've used a semicolon and what's called a conjunctive adverb to join the sentences. We've used the semicolon to separate the independent clauses, and the comma is used to set off the adverb therefore. If you read this out loud, you'll pause twice instead of once. The cause of her headaches was unknown, therefore, Mrs. Trafford was sent to the specialist. Technically, this sentence uses a semicolon with an adverb, therefore, that is working as a conjunction. To me, this gives an even higher level of formality to the sentence, and this is usually only used in writing. Here, you have to use a semicolon. If you use a comma, the sentence would be incorrect. The use of semicolons is a subject all its own, and it can get pretty complicated. So my advice to you is just to join your compound sentences with a comma and a conjunction for your OET letter. Next, let's talk about a common mistake that can occur when you write a compound sentence. Be sure to use both a comma and a conjunction. If you only use a comma, the sentence is grammatically incorrect. Here's an example. Let's read it out loud and you'll hear that this sentence is somehow incorrect. Eye drops were administered. The patient was told to return several days later. If you add a conjunction, in this sentence it should be and. You fixed the problem. Eye drops were administered and the patient was told to return several days later. Now let's talk about the third and fourth items on our list, introductory and transitional phrases. Using phrases like this will help guide your reader through your letter by showing a relationship between two ideas. They can help you organize your letter logically and help your reader follow what you're saying, which is one of the goals in your OET writing. Introductory phrases are found at the beginning of a sentence and are always followed by a comma. Let's look at some examples. On October 14th, Mrs. Parker underwent surgery for a broken ankle. As a result, she was unable to continue working. On examination, it was found that the patient was allergic to penicillin. Sometimes you can find a transitional phrase in the middle of a sentence, and in this case, it should be set off with two commas. Look at this sentence. While he was in the care center, from October through February, Mr. Parker regained movement in his shoulders. Transitional phrases in the middle of a sentence are fine, but they can add extra complications when you're writing your OET letter. Better just to remember the rules for complex and compound sentences and use them. Let's rewrite our sentence about Mr. Parker and change it into a compound sentence. Mr. Parker stayed in the care center from October to February and was able to regain movement in his shoulders. The last item on our list is probably something you're already familiar with. In English, it's possible to list ideas or items in a sentence if they're separated with commas. Each item should be clearly set apart from the others by a comma, including the final item, which would also have the word and or setting it apart. Here's an example. The patient was advised to take painkillers, antibiotics, and get plenty of bed rest. Some people don't use the final comma, as in this example. The patient was advised to take painkillers, antibiotics, and get plenty of bed rest. The idea behind this was that if you only had two items in your list, you wouldn't separate them with a comma. The patient was advised to take antibiotics and get plenty of bed rest. You can see that in this sentence, no comma is necessary. However, when you added the third item to your list, using the second comma really increases how well the reader can quickly understand what you're saying. So my advice to you is to use that second comma in your writing. The patient was advised to take painkillers, antibiotics, and get plenty of rest. Before we finish, let's take a look at how to use commas in the opening and closing parts of our letter. Look at these examples. Be sure to use a comma between the city and the state. You should also include a comma at the end of your salutation. Also, use a comma after your closing before you sign your name. You don't need to use a comma after the end of each line in the address when it is written as separate lines, which is the format you should use in your letter. Are you ready to test your comma knowledge? I'm going to show you a paragraph that has some comma mistakes. Pause the video and take as much time as you need to identify and fix the mistakes. How do you think you did? Here's the corrected paragraph. The patient has an allergy to latex and is currently taking Xanax for anxiety. Here we have two independent clauses joined with a comma and a conjunction. Notice that in the second sentence, the subject is understood because we're using the same subject as we did in the first independent clause. Next, we have a comma joining an independent clause. Last year, she had surgery on her left knee, and a dependent clause, which has fully healed now. Here's the third place that we need a correction. We have another dependent clause, although she is slightly overweight, joined to an independent clause, she has lost weight over the past 6 months and is making good progress, with a comma. Notice that the second independent clause is also made of two independent clauses, but because they're short, we left out the comma. She has lost weight over the past 6 months and is making good progress. The fourth place that needs a correction is this sentence. She takes regular exercise, however, she drinks on the weekend. We need that semicolon. To only use a comma with the conjunctive adverb however is incorrect. You can see that when you read it out loud, you'll naturally pause at the places where you've used a comma. I hope this video has helped you be more confident about how to use commas in your OET writing. Don't be afraid of complex and compound sentences. They can be super useful to help you organize information and help your letter flow smoothly. Next time you're reading in English, watch for complex and compound sentences and you'll see how common they really are. And when you use them in your letter, you'll impress the OET examiner with your knowledge of English. Benchmark Education Solutions has a lot of information about OET grammar and the OET writing subtest, so check out our website at edubenchmark.com. Also use our OET Writing Correction Service to get personalized tips on your writing from our expert OET teachers. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the bell notification so you don't miss a single video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.